They thought Emma was just another scared transfer student who would crumble under pressure. But when they left her blindfolded and alone in the middle of nowhere, they had no idea they'd just awakened something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Chun pressed her palm against the cool metal of her new locker at Cedar Creek High School, taking a steadying breath as the morning chaos swirled around her. 3 months into her senior year, and she still felt like an outsider looking through glass at a world she didn't quite understand. The transition from Pine Ridge, a mountain town where her graduating class would have been 32 students, to this sprawling suburban institution with over 2,000 pupils had been more jarring than she'd anticipated. At 17, Emma possessed the kind of understated presence that made her easily overlooked in crowded spaces. Her straight black hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she favored practical clothing that wouldn't restrict movement. Dark jeans, plain sweaters, and sturdy boots that her classmates probably assumed came from discount stores. What they couldn't see was the deliberate choice behind every piece, selected for durability and function rather than fashion. Growing up in the wilderness had taught her that survival often depended on being prepared for anything, even if that preparation now seemed unnecessary in the manicured safety of suburban life. Her father, David Chun, had been a park ranger for 15 years before a heart attack claimed him during her sophomore year. Those years spent accompanying him on backcountry patrols had shaped Emma in ways her new classmates could never guess. While other kids her age had been learning to navigate social media and shopping malls, she'd been mastering fire building, water purification, and tracking. She could read weather patterns and cloud formations, find true north without a compass, and had once helped her father rescue 3 lost hikers during a blizzard that had trapped them for 2 days. But those skills felt useless in the hallways of Cedar Creek High, where success was measured by designer handbags and weekend party invitations. Her mother had insisted on the move after the medical bills and funeral expenses made their mountain life financially impossible. The job offer at a tech company in the valley had seemed like a lifeline, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they'd traded something essential for security. The social ecosystem at Cedar Creek operated with the precision of a military hierarchy, and Emma had quickly learned to identify the key players. At the apex stood Madison Parker, a willowy blonde whose father owned half the commercial real estate in town. Madison moved through the school with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. Her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair serving as armor that announced her status to anyone within sight. She commanded attention without effort, her laugh ringing across the courtyard during lunch, her opinions shaping conversations in every classroom she entered. Madison's inner circle consisted of Chloe Martinez and Kayla Thompson, 2 girls who had apparently earned their positions through years of loyal service and strategic friendship. Chloe was the organizer, the one who planned the parties and coordinated the group's social calendar with ruthless efficiency. Kayla served as the enforcer, quick with cutting remarks that could demolish a person's confidence in seconds. Together, the 3 of them controlled the social temperature of the entire school, determining who was worthy of inclusion and who deserved exile. Emma had managed to avoid their direct attention for most of the semester by perfecting the art of invisibility. She'd learned the rhythm of their movements, timing her hallway navigation to minimize contact. She ate lunch in the library, claiming she needed to study, and chose seats in the back corners of classrooms where she could observe without being observed. It was a strategy that had served her well in the wilderness, sometimes the best way. To handle a dangerous predator was to avoid attracting its notice in the first place. The fragile piece she'd constructed began to crack during a particularly tedious morning in advanced placement literature. Mrs. Hendricks had assigned group projects analyzing themes in contemporary fiction, and Emma found herself paired with Connor Walsh, a quiet soccer player who seemed as eager to avoid drama as she was. They'd been working diligently on their presentation about survival narratives when Madison's voice cut through their whispered planning. I just think it's interesting how some people pretend to be all mysterious and deep when really they're just antisocial, Madison said, her tone light but carrying enough volume to ensure nearby students could hear. She wasn't looking directly at Emma, but the timing and context made her target unmistakable. Like, we get it, you're different and special, but maybe try actually talking to people instead of acting like you're too good for everyone. Chloe giggled on cue. Some people watch too many movies and think being weird makes them interesting. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her eyes focused on her notebook, adding careful annotations to their project outline. Connor shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly uncertain whether to acknowledge what was happening or pretend he hadn't heard. The familiar weight of isolation settled on Emma's shoulders like a heavy blanket, reminding her why she'd learned to prefer the company of trees and mountains to people. Mrs. Hendricks, either oblivious to the undercurrent or choosing to ignore it, continued circulating through the classroom, offering feedback on various projects. Emma forced herself to concentrate on the work, discussing character motivations and thematic elements, with Connor and voices barely above whispers. But she could feel Madison's gaze like a physical presence, studying her with the calculating attention of someone who had identified a new puzzle to solve. As the bell rang and students began packing their materials, Madison appeared beside Emma's desk with the kind of sudden proximity that felt deliberately invasive. "Emma, right?" Madison asked, her smile bright and seemingly genuine. "I feel like we never really got a chance to talk since you transferred here. You should totally sit with us at lunch sometime." Emma looked up, meeting Madison's perfectly made-up eyes with caution. Experience had taught her that predators often approached with friendly overtures, testing for weakness before revealing their true intentions. "Thanks," Emma replied simply, shouldering her backpack with practiced efficiency. "But I usually study during lunch." "Of course you do," Madison said, her smile never wavering but something cold flickering behind her expression. "Well, the offer stands. We'd love to get to know you better." As Emma walked toward her next class, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in her carefully maintained anonymity. The invitation from Madison Parker proved to be the beginning of Emma's problems rather than the social opportunity it had appeared to be. Over the following days, she noticed increased attention from Madison's circle, but it wasn't the welcoming kind she'd initially hoped it might be. Instead, it felt like being studied under a microscope by researchers who were trying to determine exactly what type of specimen they discovered. The scrutiny began subtly during passing periods between classes. Emma would catch Chloe and Kayla whispering while looking in her direction, their conversations dying the moment she came within earshot. In chemistry class, Madison made a point of asking Emma about her previous school, her questions delivered with such apparent friendliness that declining to answer would have seemed rude. But each query felt designed to highlight the differences between Emma's mountain background and the affluent suburban world of Cedar Creek High. "So you really lived in the middle of nowhere?" Madison asked during a lab exercise, her voice carrying just enough volume to attract nearby listeners. "Like no cell service or anything? How did you even survive without social media?" Emma focused on measuring compounds for their experiment, keeping her response neutral. "We had internet. It was just a different lifestyle." "I bet," Kayla chimed in from the adjacent lab station. "Must have been so boring though. Like, what did you even do for fun? Watch the grass grow?" The question drew snickers from several classmates, and Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being the center of unwanted attention. She'd experienced this before during her first weeks at Cedar Creek, but it had gradually faded as other students lost interest in the quiet transfer student. Now, with Madison's group shining a spotlight on her differences, The whispers and stares were returning with renewed intensity. Emma's strategy of eating lunch in the library became more difficult to maintain when Madison's group began appearing there with increasing frequency. They would claim tables near Emma's usual spot, their conversations peppered with pointed observations about people who thought they were better than everyone else. The library had been her sanctuary, a place where she could disappear into books about wilderness survival or historical adventures that reminded her of home. Now even that refuge felt compromised by their presence. The psychological pressure intensified during gym class, where Coach Martinez had organized the semester on team sports that required partner selection and group cooperation. Emma had always been naturally athletic thanks to years of hiking and outdoor activities, but her fitness came from practical application rather than competitive sports. She could outpace most of her classmates on distance runs and demonstrated surprising agility during obstacle courses, but she struggled with the social dynamics that seemed as important as physical ability in team environments. Madison, who served as an unofficial captain for most activities, began using partner selection as a weapon. She would organize teams with theatrical consideration, appearing to weigh various options before inevitably leaving Emma for last. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, and Emma recognized it as a deliberate strategy to highlight her outsider status. Standing alone while teams formed around her became a weekly humiliation that left her dreading what had once been her favorite class. The harassment escalated beyond passive exclusion when Madison discovered Emma's habit of spending free periods outdoors. Cedar Creek High boasted an extensive campus with landscaped courtyards and wooded areas that provided quiet spaces for students who preferred fresh air to crowded hallways. Emma had found a particular spot near the back of the property where a cluster of oak trees created natural seating and offered a view of the mountains that reminded her of home. Madison and her friends began appearing at Emma's outdoor retreat with the same calculated frequency they'd brought to the library. They would position themselves within earshot and launch into conversations clearly designed for Emma's benefit. They discussed upcoming parties with elaborate detail about who was invited and who wasn't, shared gossip about students who tried too hard to fit in, and made pointed observations about people who preferred trees to human company. I just think it's weird when someone acts like they're too good for normal social interaction, Madison said during one such performance, her voice carrying clearly across the small clearing. Like, we're all trying to be friendly, but some people would rather sit alone and judge everyone. Chloe nodded enthusiastically. Totally. It's like they think being antisocial makes them deep or something. But really, it just makes them weird. Emma forced herself to remain focused on her reading, a field guide to Pacific Northwest flora that her father had given her years earlier. The familiar illustrations of native plants and trees provided comfort, reminding her of weekend hikes, when the only sounds had been wind through branches and distant bird calls. She wished desperately that she could transport herself back to those simpler times, when human interaction hadn't felt like navigating a minefield. The situation reached a new level of complexity when Emma's academic performance began attracting attention from teachers. Her outdoor background had given her unique perspectives on environmental science and geography that impressed her instructors, and her wilderness experience provided practical knowledge that complemented textbook learning in unexpected ways. When Mr. Rodriguez asked her to share insights about weather pattern recognition during an earth science discussion, her detailed explanation earned appreciative nods from classmates and genuine praise from the teacher. Madison's expression during that exchange had been particularly telling. Emma caught the flash of irritation that crossed her face when the class responded positively to Emma's contribution, as if the quiet transfer student had somehow violated an unspoken rule about knowing her place in the social hierarchy. That moment seemed to mark a shift in Madison's approach from passive exclusion to more active intimidation. The escalation became apparent when Emma began finding her belongings mysteriously displaced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her backpack would be moved from where she'd left it. Books would disappear from her locker, only to reappear days later in random locations. And her carefully organized class materials would be scattered in ways that seemed designed to create maximum inconvenience. The incidents were subtle enough to avoid teacher notice, but consistent enough to create constant anxiety about where her possessions might end up. Emma's locker combination was changed without explanation, forcing her to visit the main office for a new one. When she mentioned the problem to the secretary, she was told that students sometimes forgot their combinations and accidentally triggered the reset mechanism. The explanation felt insufficient, but Emma lacked evidence to suggest deliberate sabotage. She began carrying all her materials with her throughout the day, unwilling to risk further mysterious disappearances. The psychological toll of constant vigilance began wearing on Emma's academic performance and general well-being. She found herself second-guessing every interaction, analyzing conversations for hidden meanings and potential traps. The social skills that had served her well in small-town environments felt inadequate for navigating the complex dynamics of suburban high school politics. She missed the straightforward honesty of mountain life, where challenges were direct and solutions were practical. Her mother noticed the change during their evening conversations, expressing concern about Emma's increasing withdrawal and apparent unhappiness. Emma deflected these inquiries with vague references to normal adjustment difficulties, unwilling to admit that she was struggling with something as basic as teenage social dynamics. She'd survived blizzards and helped rescue lost hikers, but somehow couldn't figure out how to handle a group of popular girls who seemed determined to make her miserable. The campaign against Emma intensified as Madison appeared to realize that subtle harassment wasn't achieving the desired result. Instead of retreating or seeking help, Emma had simply adapted to each new challenge with the same practical resilience she'd learned in the wilderness. This response seemed to frustrate Madison, who was accustomed to more immediate and dramatic reactions to her social pressure tactics. Madison's frustration with Emma's resilience became increasingly apparent as winter settled over Cedar Creek High. Unlike her previous targets who had either crumbled under social pressure or fought back with dramatic outbursts that provided satisfying entertainment, Emma simply endured each new challenge with an unnerving calmness that seemed to deflect Madison's efforts rather than absorb them. This unexpected resistance sparked something darker in Madison's approach, transforming what had begun as casual bullying into a more focused campaign of psychological warfare. The shift became evident during a particularly cold February morning, when Emma arrived at school to find her locker vandalized with crude drawings and hateful messages. The janitor had already been alerted and was in the process of cleaning the metal surface when Emma approached, his sympathetic expression suggesting this wasn't the first such incident he'd encountered. The maintenance worker, an older man named Frank, who had always been kind to Emma, shook his head as he scrubbed away the graffiti. "Kids these days don't have any respect," Frank muttered, applying more cleaning solution to a particularly stubborn mark. "Back in my day, you had a problem with someone. You talked it out face to face." Emma thanked him quietly and gathered her books, but the incident marked a clear escalation in the harassment campaign. The vandalism had required advanced planning and access to school property after hours, suggesting a level of commitment that went beyond casual cruelty. More troubling was the realization that Madison felt confident enough in her social position to risk such blatant rule violations, apparently certain that any consequences would be minimal. The psychological pressure intensified when Emma began receiving anonymous text messages on her phone. The messages arrived at irregular intervals, usually during classes when responding would be impossible, and contained thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly advice. The sender suggested that Emma would be happier if she transferred to a different school, that her antisocial behavior was concerning her classmates, and that continuing to isolate herself would only lead to more problems. Emma recognized the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign and understood that Madison was probing for weaknesses with the systematic approach of someone who had perfected these tactics through previous experience. Each method was designed to create maximum stress while maintaining plausible deniability, allowing Madison to appear innocent if questioned by authority figures. The anonymous messages could have come from anyone. The locker vandalism might have been random, and the social exclusion could be explained as natural group dynamics rather than deliberate cruelty. What Madison couldn't have anticipated was that Emma's wilderness background had prepared her for exactly this type of psychological endurance test. During her years accompanying her father on extended backcountry expeditions, she'd learned that survival often depended on maintaining mental equilibrium under extreme stress. Whether facing sudden weather changes, equipment failures, or dangerous wildlife encounters, panic and emotional reactions could prove fatal in wilderness environments. Emma applied those same principles to navigating the social wilderness of Cedar Creek High. She documented each incident with the methodical attention her father had taught her to use when tracking animal behavior, noting patterns and timing that might prove useful later. She varied her daily routines to make her movements less predictable, used alternate routes through the building to avoid confrontations, and maintained the emotional distance necessary to think clearly under pressure. This analytical approach revealed information about Madison's group that Emma found particularly interesting. She noticed that Chloe and Kayla seemed less enthusiastic about the harassment campaign when Madison wasn't present to orchestrate their actions. During classes where Madison was absent, they largely ignored Emma rather than continuing the pattern of deliberate provocation. This suggested that the systematic nature of the bullying stemmed primarily from Madison's leadership rather than genuine animosity from the entire group. Emma also observed that Madison's social power operated within specific boundaries and relied heavily on maintaining her reputation among the broader student body. When incidents occurred in view of teachers or other adults, Madison was careful to maintain her facade of friendly popularity. The harassment intensified in spaces where adult supervision was minimal and witness testimony would be unreliable, revealing both the calculated nature of Madison's approach and potential vulnerabilities. In her strategy, the most significant escalation occurred during a school-sponsored camping trip to nearby Pine Valley State Park in early March. The overnight excursion was designed to provide hands-on environmental education for students in advanced science classes combining hiking, wildlife observation, and outdoor survival exercises under teacher supervision. For most of Cedar Creek High's suburban students, the trip represented their first extended exposure to genuine wilderness conditions. Emma had initially been excited about the opportunity to return to an environment where her skills would be assets rather than oddities. The familiar smells of pine needles and wood smoke, the sound of wind through trees, and the vast canopy of stars visible away from city lights reminded her powerfully of the life she'd left behind. During the day's educational activities, she found herself naturally taking leadership roles in group exercises, her knowledge of plant identification and wildlife tracking impressing both teachers and classmates. Mr. Rodriguez, the earth science instructor leading the expedition, seemed particularly pleased with Emma's contributions to the group discussions. When several students struggled with basic compass navigation during an afternoon orienteering exercise, Emma quietly assisted them with techniques her father had taught her years earlier. Her practical knowledge complemented the theoretical instruction in ways that enhanced the learning experience for everyone involved. Madison watched these interactions with growing irritation, clearly frustrated by Emma's sudden transformation from social outcast to valuable group member. In the wilderness setting, Emma's quiet confidence and practical skills commanded natural respect from classmates who had previously dismissed her as antisocial and weird. The reversal of social dynamics seemed to trigger something deeper in Madison's competitive nature, as if Emma's competence in this environment somehow diminished. Madison's own status. The group had been divided into smaller camping units for the overnight portion of the trip, with teachers rotating between campsites to ensure safety and provide supervision. Emma found herself assigned to a group that included Madison, Chloe, Kayla, and 3 other students who had maintained neutral attitudes toward the ongoing social conflict. The arrangement seemed innocuous enough during the evening meal and campfire activities, with everyone focused on the novelty of outdoor living and the structured educational programming. As night fell and the teachers retreated to their own camping area, the group dynamics began shifting in ways that made Emma increasingly uncomfortable. Madison suggested a midnight adventure to explore areas of the park that had been designated off-limits during the day's activities, framing the proposal as harmless fun that would create memorable bonding experiences for the group. Emma's wilderness instincts immediately recognized the proposal as dangerous and irresponsible. The terrain beyond their designated camping area included steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and potentially unstable rock formations that posed serious risks even during daylight hours. Attempting to navigate such terrain in darkness without proper equipment or adult supervision violated every safety principle her father had drilled into her during years of backcountry experience. When Emma voiced these concerns, suggesting that the group stick to approved areas and established safety protocols, Madison's response revealed the true nature of her midnight adventure proposal. The suggestion hadn't been about exploration or group bonding at all, but rather another opportunity to test Emma's social compliance and potentially create a situation where she could be isolated and intimidated away from any possible intervention. Madison's smile carried a coldness that Emma recognized from their previous encounters, but magnified by the remote setting and temporary absence of adult authority. The wilderness that had felt like a homecoming to Emma was about to become the stage for Madison's most aggressive escalation yet. The midnight expedition began innocently enough, with Madison leading the group away from their designated campsite under the pretense of finding a better view of the stars. She had produced small flashlights for everyone, claiming she'd brought extras specifically for such an adventure, though Emma noticed the calculated way Madison distributed them to ensure she maintained control over the group's light sources. The other students seemed excited by the prospect of breaking minor rules, their whispered conversations filled with nervous energy and anticipation of forbidden exploration. Emma reluctantly joined the group, recognizing that refusing to participate would only provide Madison with ammunition for future harassment, while potentially leaving her alone and vulnerable at the campsite. Her wilderness instincts screamed warnings about the wisdom of unauthorized nighttime navigation, but she also understood that isolation from the group could prove more dangerous than whatever Madison had planned. At least by staying with them, she could monitor the situation and intervene if safety became a serious concern. The terrain beyond their campsite proved exactly as treacherous as Emma had anticipated. Loose rocks shifted underfoot as they climbed, away from the established trails, and low-hanging branches created obstacles that were difficult to navigate, even with flashlight assistance. Madison maintained a cheerful running commentary about their adventure, but Emma noticed the deliberate way she was leading them deeper into unfamiliar territory, following routes that would make returning to camp increasingly difficult for someone without orienteering experience. After 20 minutes of careful climbing, Madison called for a rest stop in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. The location was completely isolated from the camping area, with no visible landmarks and no sounds from the main group. Emma recognized immediately that they had traveled far enough from camp to be beyond earshot of any supervisors, creating exactly the type of unsupervised environment where Madison's previous escalations had occurred. "This is perfect, Madison," announced, settling onto a fallen log with theatrical satisfaction. "We can see everything from here, and no one will bother us with stupid rules about staying in designated areas." Chloe and Kayla positioned themselves on either side of Madison, with practiced coordination, while the other students arranged themselves in a loose circle around the clearing. Emma remained standing near the edge of the group, her attention divided between the social dynamics developing among her classmates and her growing concern about their remote location. The temperature had dropped significantly since leaving camp, and she could hear wind picking up in the trees overhead, suggesting that weather conditions might deteriorate before morning. Madison's conversation gradually shifted from general excitement about their adventure to more pointed observations about different students' reactions to the wilderness experience. She made seemingly casual comments about who seemed comfortable with outdoor challenges and who appeared nervous about being away from civilization. Emma recognized the pattern from Madison's previous social manipulation tactics, but in this isolated setting, the psychological pressure felt more intense and potentially dangerous. "It's interesting how some people act all tough and independent, but they're actually just as scared as everyone else when it really matters," Madison said, her voice carrying clearly across the small clearing. "Like, we've all heard about Emma's mountain girl background, but I bet she's actually just as freaked out by being in the woods at night as the rest of us." Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied Madison's targeted provocations, but she forced herself to remain calm and observant. Something about Madison's tone suggested that this midnight expedition was building toward specific goal rather than random harassment. The location, timing, and group composition felt too deliberate to be coincidental, indicating that Madison had been planning this confrontation since before the camping trip began. Kayla giggled on cue. "I mean, talking about survival skills is easy when you're safe at school, but actually being out here in the dark is totally different." "Exactly," Chloe added, her voice carrying mock concern. "I bet Emma is actually terrified right now, but trying to act brave because she doesn't want us to know. She's been lying about being some kind of outdoor expert." The other students shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the underlying tension, but uncertain about how to respond to the obvious targeting. Emma noticed that two of them kept glancing toward the direction they'd come from, as if already thinking about the return journey to camp. Their nervousness seemed genuine, unlike the calculated performance being delivered by Madison's inner circle. Madison stood up with sudden energy, as if struck by inspiration. "You know what would be really fun? We should play a trust game. Like, someone gets blindfolded and has to navigate back to camp using only their other senses. It would be like a real survival challenge." Emma's warning instincts immediately escalated to full alert. The proposal sounded superficially playful, but every detail felt designed to create vulnerability and potential danger. Blindfolded navigation in unfamiliar terrain during darkness violated fundamental safety principles, and the group's remote location meant that any mishap could have serious consequences. More importantly, Emma recognized that Madison's suggestion was aimed specifically at her, designed to exploit her supposed wilderness expertise while creating an opportunity for humiliation or worse. "That sounds really dangerous," one of the neutral students said, voicing Emma's concerns. "What if someone gets hurt or lost?" "Oh, don't be such a baby," Madison replied dismissively. "It's just for fun, and we'll all be here to help if anything goes wrong. Besides, I thought some people in our group were supposed to be experts at this kind of thing." The challenge was clearly directed at Emma, delivered with the same calculated pressure Madison had used in previous confrontations. Refusing to participate would provide ammunition for future harassment about being a fraud who couldn't back up her wilderness claims. But accepting the challenge would place Emma in a deliberately vulnerable position while surrounded by people who had already demonstrated hostile intentions. Emma weighed her options quickly, drawing on the decision-making skills her father had taught her for handling dangerous situations in the wilderness. Sometimes the safest course involved accepting calculated risks to avoid greater dangers, and sometimes survival required making choices that seemed counterintuitive in the moment. Madison's challenge felt like a trap, but refusing might provoke an even more dangerous escalation. "Okay," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heartbeat. "But we should establish some basic safety rules first." Madison's smile widened with predatory satisfaction, as if Emma's acceptance had confirmed something she'd been hoping to prove. "Of course. Safety first, right? We wouldn't want anything bad to happen to our wilderness expert." Chloe produced a dark bandana from her backpack with suspicious readiness, suggesting that the blindfold had been planned in advance rather than improvised in the moment. The fabric looked thick enough to completely block vision, and Emma noticed that it had been folded in a way that would make removal difficult without assistance. Every detail of Madison's proposal felt increasingly calculated and malicious. "The rules are simple," Madison explained as Chloe approached Emma with the blindfold. "You navigate back toward camp using whatever amazing survival skills you're always talking about. We'll follow at a distance to make sure you don't get completely lost, but you have to figure out the route yourself. If you're really as good as you claim, it should be easy." Emma stood perfectly still as Chloe tied the bandana on her eyes, but her mind was racing through contingency plans and escape strategies. The blindfold blocked her vision completely, reducing her awareness to sounds, smells, and the feeling of uneven ground beneath her feet. She could hear Madison's group whispering among themselves, their voices carrying undertones of excitement and anticipation that suggested this challenge was about to become something far more sinister than a simple trust exercise. "Ready?" Madison asked, her voice now coming from several feet away. "Remember, we're all counting on you to show us how it's done." Emma nodded, though she suspected that Madison's definition of the challenge was about to change dramatically. The wilderness that had felt like home earlier in the day now felt alien and threatening, transformed by darkness and malicious intent into something that would test every survival skill she'd ever learned. Emma stood motionless for several seconds after the blindfold was secured, allowing her other senses to adjust and gather information about her surroundings. The fabric blocked her vision completely, but years of wilderness training had taught her that sight was only one tool for navigation, and often not the most reliable one in challenging conditions. She could hear Madison's group shifting positions around her, their whispered conversations creating a rough mental map of where each person stood in relation to her current position. The wind direction told her they were facing roughly northeast, based on the prevailing patterns she'd observed earlier in the day. The scent of pine sap was stronger to her left, suggesting denser tree coverage in that direction, while the sound of her own footsteps indicated they were standing on a mixture of pine needles and loose soil. These details would normally seem insignificant, but Emma's father had drilled into her the importance of constant environmental awareness during their wilderness expeditions. "Whenever you're ready," Madison said, her voice carrying artificial encouragement that barely concealed her anticipation. "Take your time getting oriented. We'll be right behind you to make sure nothing bad happens." Emma began moving slowly toward what she calculated was the general direction of their campsite, using the gentle downward slope of the terrain as her primary guide. She knew from their earlier ascent that they had climbed consistently to reach this clearing, which meant the return journey should involve a corresponding descent. Her feet tested each step carefully, feeling for obstacles and using the density of pine needle coverage to gauge her proximity to trees. Behind her, she could hear Madison's group following at what sounded like a respectful distance. Their conversations remained audible, filled with nervous energy and occasional comments about Emma's progress. But something in their tone began shifting after the first few minutes of careful navigation, their voices becoming more distant and their comments taking on a different quality that made Emma increasingly suspicious about their true intentions. "She's actually doing pretty well," one of the neutral students said, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "Maybe she really does know what she's doing out here." "Give it time," Madison replied, though her voice sounded farther away than it had moments earlier. "The real test comes when the terrain gets more challenging." Emma continued her methodical progress down the slope, but she was beginning to realize that Madison's group was not maintaining the promised escort distance. Their voices were becoming increasingly faint, and the sounds of their movement through the undergrowth had virtually disappeared. Her growing suspicion crystallized into certainty when she deliberately created a loud noise by stepping on a dry branch, then paused to listen for reactions from her supposed supervisors. The silence that followed confirmed her worst fears. The wilderness experience was teaching Emma something important about her own identity and priorities. She didn't need Madison's approval or acceptance to feel worthy of respect. Her sense of self-worth came from demonstrated competence in areas that mattered to her, not from conformity to social expectations that felt artificial and meaningless. The skills her father had taught her represented a connection to something authentic and valuable that couldn't be diminished by teenage social dynamics. As the sound of flowing water grew louder, indicating proximity to the larger creek that bordered their camping area, Emma began planning her confrontation with Madison's group. She had several options for how to handle the situation, ranging from immediate reporting to school authorities to private resolution that would avoid external consequences for everyone involved. The choice would depend partly on Madison's reaction to Emma's successful return and her apparent willingness to acknowledge the dangerous nature of her actions. Emma emerged from the tree line to find Madison's group huddled around their sleeping area, clearly anxious about her prolonged absence but unwilling to seek adult help without revealing their unauthorized midnight expedition. The relief at seeing her safe was mixed with obvious confusion about how she had managed to navigate back successfully. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her approaching, and Emma could see fear beginning to replace relief in their expressions as they realized the implications of her safe return. "Emma!" Chloe exclaimed with forced enthusiasm that couldn't disguise her underlying nervousness. "We were starting to worry about you. How did you find your way back so quickly?" Emma studied the group with new eyes, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since arriving at Cedar Creek High School. Madison sat slightly apart from the others, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like vulnerability. Kayla appeared genuinely distressed, suggesting that she might not have fully understood the potential consequences of abandoning someone in wilderness terrain. The neutral students looked confused and concerned, apparently unaware that abandonment had been part of Madison's plan. "Where were you?" Emma asked quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that silenced the group's nervous chatter. "I thought you were going to follow at a distance to make sure nothing bad happened." Madison's attempt to maintain her innocent facade crumbled under Emma's steady gaze. "We got turned around. We were trying to find you, but the terrain was more confusing than we expected." Emma let the silence stretch for several moments, allowing Madison's lie to hang mid-air between them. She had learned from her father that sometimes the most effective confrontations involve giving people enough space to reveal their true character through their choices about honesty and accountability. "No," Emma said simply. "You left me out. They're blindfolded and alone, hoping I'd get lost or hurt or scared enough to prove whatever point you were trying to make about me being a fraud." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Emma watched Madison's expression cycle through denial, anger, and something that might have been fear as she realized the potential consequences of her actions. Abandoning a fellow student in wilderness terrain could result in serious disciplinary action if reported to school authorities, and Madison's carefully maintained reputation could be destroyed by evidence of such reckless endangerment. "But here's what you didn't understand," Emma continued, her voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable strength. The wilderness isn't my weakness. It's where I belong. Those skills you thought were fake? They're the only reason I'm standing here safely instead of lost in the woods while you try to explain to teachers why you can't find me." Madison stared at her with growing comprehension, finally understanding that her elaborate harassment campaign had not only failed but had revealed Emma's true capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. The quiet transfer student she dismissed as weak and antisocial had just accomplished something that none of Madison's group could have managed, navigating safely through dangerous terrain using skills they didn't even know existed. "What happens now?" Madison asked, her voice smaller than Emma had ever heard it. Emma considered the question carefully, weighing various responses and their potential consequences. She could report the incident to Mr. Rodriguez and watch Madison face serious disciplinary action that might include expulsion from school. She could demand public acknowledgement of Madison's harassment campaign and insist on formal apologies that would humiliate her tormentor in front of their classmates. She could even use her newfound position of strength to begin her own campaign of social retaliation. But none of those options felt consistent with the values her father had taught her during their years together in the wilderness. David Chun had always emphasized that true strength came from protection rather than domination, from building others up rather than tearing them down. The most powerful response to Madison's cruelty wouldn't be matching it with cruelty of her own, but demonstrating a better way to handle conflict and difference. "Now you know who I really am," Emma said simply. "And maybe next time you'll think twice before assuming someone is weak just because they're different from you." She turned toward her sleeping bag, then paused and looked back at Madison's group. "And maybe you'll think about what could have happened if I really had been the helpless victim you thought I was. What would you have told my mother if I hadn't made it back?" The question struck Madison like a physical blow, her face going pale as she confronted the potential consequences of her actions for the first time. Emma could see the exact moment when Madison realized that her harassment campaign could have resulted in genuine tragedy, not just the social victory she had been seeking. The weight of that responsibility seemed to settle on Madison's shoulders, like a heavy burden she would carry long after the camping trip ended. Emma settled into her sleeping bag without another word, but sleep proved elusive as adrenaline from her wilderness navigation slowly subsided. She lay listening to the sounds of the forest around them, finding comfort in the familiar symphony of wind through pine needles and distant wildlife activity. For the first time since transferring to Cedar Creek High School, she felt truly at peace with herself and her circumstances. The remaining hours until dawn passed quietly, with Madison's group maintaining respectful silence that suggested they were processing the evening's events and their implications. Emma dozed intermittently, but she remained alert enough to monitor her surroundings and ensure that no additional problems developed before morning brought the return of adult supervision. When Mr. Rodriguez and the other teachers arrived to wake the students for breakfast, they found a subdued group that seemed markedly different from the excited teenagers who had begun the camping expedition. Emma participated normally in the morning activities, but she noticed that Madison's usual commanding presence had been replaced by uncharacteristic, quiet reflection. The dynamic between the entire group had shifted in ways that would probably take days or weeks to fully understand. The bus ride back to Cedar Creek High School provided Emma with additional time to observe the lasting effects of her midnight confrontation with Madison's harassment campaign. Students who had previously ignored her existence were now approaching with genuine curiosity about her wilderness background. Even more surprisingly, some of Madison's former allies seemed to be reconsidering their automatic allegiance to her social leadership. Word of Emma's successful solo navigation spread through the school with the inevitable speed of teenage gossip, but the story that emerged was remarkably accurate rather than the usual distorted rumors that accompanied dramatic events. Students who had witnessed Emma's competence during the day's educational activities provided context that supported rather than undermined her credibility. The combination of demonstrated skills and verified results created a narrative that even Madison's most loyal supporters couldn't effectively challenge. The transformation in Emma's social status at Cedar Creek High School was gradual but unmistakable. Teachers began including her perspectives in environmental science discussions, recognizing that her practical experience complemented their theoretical knowledge in valuable ways. Students approached her with questions about outdoor activities and survival techniques, treating her expertise with genuine respect rather than dismissive mockery. More importantly, Madison's systematic harassment campaign effectively ended. After the camping trip incident, whether motivated by fear of consequences or genuine remorse about the potential dangers she had created, Madison maintained respectful distance from Emma and made no further attempts at social intimidation. Her inner circle seemed equally subdued, as if the wilderness experience had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their behavior and its potential consequences. Emma never reported the abandonment incident to school authorities, understanding that sometimes the most effective consequences were those that came from natural results rather than external punishment. Madison had learned a valuable lesson about underestimating people, and Emma had discovered that her wilderness heritage was a source of strength rather than embarrassment in any environment where authenticity mattered more than social performance. The lasting impact of that midnight in the wilderness extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other students who had suffered under similar harassment campaigns found inspiration in Emma's example, discovering that resistance didn't require adopting the aggressor's tactics or values. Several approached Emma privately to share their own experiences and seek advice about handling social pressure and bullying. Emma's response to these conversations reflected the wisdom her father had tried to instill in her during their years. Together, she encouraged students to identify their own sources of strength and authenticity rather than trying to conform to arbitrary social expectations. She shared techniques for maintaining emotional equilibrium under pressure and emphasized the importance of building genuine relationships based on shared interests and mutual respect. As spring arrived at Cedar Creek High School, Emma found herself looking forward to graduation with anticipation rather than mere endurance. She had successfully defended her dignity without compromising her values, demonstrated that strength could coexist with gentleness, and proven that wilderness skills translated into life skills that served her well in any challenging environment. The acceptance letter from Colorado State University's Environmental Science program arrived in early April, offering Emma the opportunity to pursue studies that would honor her father's memory while building on the foundation he had provided. The scholarship was generous enough to make attendance financially feasible, and the program's emphasis on practical field experience promised to combine academic learning with the hands-on outdoor education she had always valued most. Madison approached Emma on the last day of classes, her manner hesitant but seemingly genuine. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for what happened on the camping trip. And for everything before that. I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry." Emma studied Madison's expression, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only what appeared to be authentic remorse. "Thank you," she replied simply. "I hope you learned something from it." "I did," Madison said. "I learned that being popular doesn't give you the right to hurt people. And I learned that there are different kinds of strength." They parted without dramatic reconciliation or renewed friendship, but with mutual understanding that growth was possible for everyone willing to examine their actions honestly. Emma walked away from Cedar Creek High School feeling proud of the person she had become and optimistic about the future she was building on the foundation her father had provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.